Sabah oturumumuzda davetli konuşmacılarımız Profesör Doktor Ümit Atabek, Profesör Doktor Simon Cottle ve Doçent Doktor Gregory Simmons yer alacaklar. Oturumu Bilgi Üniversitesi İletişim Fakültesi Dekanı Profesör Doktor Halil Nalçıoğlu yönetecek. Tümüyle İngilizce olarak gerçekleştirilecek olan oturumun Zoom üzerinden simultane çevirisi de yapılacak. Sempozyumu Türkçe olarak izlemek isteyenler Zoom'da Interpretation sekmesine tıklayarak dil tercihlerini yapabilirler. Programın öğleden sonraki kısmında eş zamanlı oturumlar yer alacak. Programın ilk eş zamanlı oturumu 13.30-15 saatleri arasında, ikinci eş zamanlı oturumu ise 15.30-17.30 saatleri arasında gerçekleştirilecek. Şimdi oturumu yönetmek üzere sözü Profesör Doktor Sayın Halil Nalçıoğlu'na bırakıyorum.
Thank you, Vesna. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope everything is okay for everyone. I will repeat some of Vesna's words. Welcome to the 8th International Communication Days organized by Üsküdar University. And welcome to the special panel, keynote panel titled Crisis Communication in the Digital Age. We have, I hope that we will have a great series of papers presented, and we will have a nice conversation in the context of crisis communication. Very interesting two words, crisis and communication. I guess Ümit Atabek would tackle with that problem, crisis and communication, because there are certain arguments that communication is crisis itself. Is the raison d'être of communication a crisis, or vice versa? Does crisis lead up to communication? So let me try to very roughly describe the organization of our panel. Well, reviewing the abstracts, I realized that Professor Atabek's presentation is on the theory line. So it is quite an abstract description of these terms with a touch of etymology. He is an expert in etymology. I know it personally. But anyhow, so I thought it would be wise to start with Professor Atabek to draw a general framework for the further discussions and further panelists. The rest, the second and third talks are, they at least seem to me to be kind of a research-oriented or interpretation of current events, the pandemic or COVID-19. So I made up a lineup for talks, but I just learned that Simon will join noon time. So we will start with Ümit Atabek and then move on to Greg Simmons. And then we will have Simon to deliver his talk. For the talks, for my calculation, so 30 minutes would be okay. After each talk, I don't know, should we take questions right after the speeches, or should we wait the end of the panel? Any opinions on that? Which would be more efficient? What do you say, Ümit Hocam?
Well, I prefer that I have the questions at the end of my presentation.
Okay.
But
so we will have presentation, Q&A. I will try to read questions from chat, I guess. As far as I could manage that, I will direct the questions to the keynote speaker. So let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Ümit Atabek. It is a very difficult task, actually, if you're an old friend with someone who know a lot about, and also who I have a written material in front of me. Well, I'll do it my way. I'll do it in a more informal way. Ümit Hoca, Ümit Atabek is I guess, a legend in the communication circles in Turkey.
Right.
Everyone knows him. I mean, I guess our participants really would not need any introduction for Professor Atabek. But let me try to draw a few basic lines to introduce him. He's a graduate of Middle East Technical University Economic and Administrative Sciences faculty. He then moved on to Ankara University Faculty of Political Sciences. And then he spent some time in Perugia prior to his further academic studies. And he then started working in Gazi University, Ankara, in Faculty of Communication. He served as a department head there in Gazi University, and also vice dean. And then actually our acquaintance with Ümit dates back to those days because he was also teaching at my first university, Ankara University Faculty of Communication. He taught graduate courses and also undergraduate courses there. He actually spent quite some time in Eastern Mediterranean University in Cyprus in the Faculty of Communication. Then he moved a little bit north from there and settled in Akdeniz University. And he served there as the dean, besides department head. Currently, Ümit Hoca is teaching in Yaşar University in Izmir. I just learned that he is actually moving back to Antalya soon to continue his academic job as a, I don't know, what shall I say, outsider. There is no, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, as the lyrics go, Ümit. And his interests is academic interests, as most of us know, communication technologies, communication research methodologies, and political economy of communication. He has a very interesting title for today. He says in his title, Communication in Crisis, Will Communication and Media Technologies Help? And I guess we will learn if communication and media technologies help or not in his speech. So, Ümit Hocam, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Halil Hocam, for this marvelous introduction. And I'm very much shocked with my curriculum vitae. Thank you. I don't know if you can see my presentation. I prepared the presentation as a conventional academician. I think there's no technical problem. You can all see.
Yes, it's quite visible.
Okay, I first of all have to thank to the organizing committee of this well-structured and well-designed event, especially to Nazife Güngör and her team, of course, for their efforts and for inviting me, of course, to this nice event. As briefly explained and summarized by Halil Hoca, the main purpose of my presentation is to develop some arguments, if possible, concerning the potentials of communication and media technologies in relation to the communication crisis. Therefore, my topic is the communication in crisis, not the crisis communication as a technical term, but I prefer to look at the events of today from the perspective of the crisis in communication. Let me just briefly explain what I'm going to talk today. I will start with an introduction, which will have an etymological perspective, and I'm planning to redefine the two basic concepts, crisis and technology. And then I will try to relate the technology and crisis. What is the relationship between the two and claiming that technology is accompanying the crisis. It's not causing the crisis, but it is together with the crisis. And then I will focus on the crisis in communication and media industry in general. And I will try to give some examples, both from Turkey and from the global perspective. And finally, I'm going to speculate, of course, about the future, because to talk about the future is always including some speculations. Let me start with the concepts. The first concept is crisis, and the second concept that I'm going to redefine is technology. I'm purposefully using the redefinition or reconstructing instead of the postmodern concept of deconstructing, which is somehow dangerous for me, because after the deconstructing, the concept may not be useful anymore. Therefore, I need these concepts very much. Therefore, I'm going to reconstruct them or redefine them so that I clarify myself what actually do I mean with this crisis and technology. For the definition of crisis, I'm going to use the definition from Gramsci, from his famous prison notebooks. He actually defined the crisis of authority, not the crisis in general, but this specific definition is helpful for understanding the concept of crisis in general. I quote directly from him: "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So, according to him, there is a passage, transition from the old, which is dying, and the new yet cannot be born. And this interregnum, this transition period, there are lots of interesting things to watch. There are very shocking symptoms, as we live today. There are very surprises to appear. Well, interregnum, I could use the word fetret devri in Turkish, which is something like the interregnum, but in the sense that Gramsci is using. Actually, it is a transition from one phase to the other. In Turkish, we use the word buhran, which is an Arabic word, of course, which is a turning point in a disease. You get the disease, and there's a critical point, and afterwards, you either die or you get well. This is buhran, which is a crisis for Turkish. But in modern Turkish, we use also bunalım, which is coming from the Central Anatolian Turkish, and the root is bon, which is actually today's bön, which is something like a stupid person. So during the bunalım, during the crisis, we become somehow bön. We don't know what to do. We don't conceive what is happening, and we become somehow stupid. So this is the etymological background of crisis in Old and Modern Turkish. Therefore, in general, crisis is a transition period from one old phase to the another new phase. And in this new phase, we have a new paradigm. But this new paradigm has not yet emerged. The second main concept I'm going to talk about is technology. As we all know, it comes from the ancient Greek words techne and logos, which actually means the knowledge for producing things, because techne has something to do with the production, and logos, as we all know, it is the potential for knowing. It's actually the words, but it is in the sense here that something like psychology, biology, so it's the knowledge, systematic knowledge of producing things, which means that technology is the knowledge of producing goods and services. And here we have to distinguish between the two terms, techniques and technology. Techniques is more narrow, while technology has a broader sense, a modern sense, of course. Technology comes later in the beginning of the 19th century. And it is the socialized knowledge of producing. You may have a personal technique to produce yogurt, for instance, but technology, production of yogurt technology in a factory, which happens to be based on the socialized knowledge. So the technology is produced through the socialized procedures in the social networks. So it's more broader. However, after the second half of the 20th century, and especially the beginning of the 21st century, we observed that this notion of technology, knowledge as a production, has changed slightly. And now today, in the masses, most of the people believe that technology is not anymore the knowledge for production, but it is the knowledge of consumption. So when we talk about the technology today, in media, for instance, it is the knowledge of consuming high-tech products like mobile phones, satellites, and cars and everything. So it is the knowledge of consumption today. What does this mean? It means that we have in the media, in general, a techno-fetishism. So therefore, today we conceive technology as the desire of getting of or appropriating of high-tech consumer goods and services. Now I'm going to relate technology with crisis, which I believe that it is the crisis for labor. Therefore, I'm going to talk about the relationship between the technology and labor. Here I quoted from Karl Marx, where he explains the situation in the printing industry in the 18th century in Britain. With the introduction of the new machinery, he explains in detail how the working conditions get worsened and how miserable the working young boys have to work under the new system of higher technology. So what actually he says here, higher the technology, lower the wages and lower the working conditions. Therefore, with the introduction of high technology in a workplace, brings higher rates of exploitation of labor because it increases the surplus value. The new technology, higher technology, increases the surplus value. And this means actually that the labor is exploited more. Therefore, higher technology brings higher rates of exploitation of labor. And this, in turn, decreases the wages and worsens the working conditions and lowers the reputation and the self-esteem. Now I'm going to give two examples. First from a national level, from Turkey, and the second is from the global level. We know the history of Turkish journalism, a transition from Babali journalism to İkitelli journalism. We know that Babali journalism is a metaphor for the conventional journalism with the standard technology. However, İkitelli journalism is the highest technology, modern technology in plazas. And with the introduction of higher technology, or the appetite for the technology in İkitelli plazas, we observe the fact that higher the technology, lower the journalism quality. And we can clearly see that in İkitelli journalism, the wages are low. Of course, there is a level distinction between the stars and the standard journalists. The majority of the journalists have low wages, but only exceptional stars are earning a lot. With the introduction of technology, we have no unions, low reputation and self-esteem, and loss of many jobs. Therefore, from our national experience, we can say that high technology did not bring any happiness to journalists in general. On the global level, I will give the example of Amazon Mechanical Turk. Amazon Mechanical Turk is a service provided by Amazon, which is a big tech firm, which is a actually, it is recently very much criticized in the United States, and the governments with the governments even in the United States have many problems with these big tech firms, and 5 giants they call it, and Amazon is one of them. And we can observe that these big tech firms employ the lowest quality of labor with the lowest wage in this Mechanical Turk system. What does the workers in the Mechanical Turk do? They just simply distinguish between the pictures of cars and boats, or cats or dogs. So it's a very primitive quality of labor, and they earn very low amounts of wages, with the lowest wages. And therefore, we understand from this example that the highest technological skills confront with the still manual work, with the low wage and low quality of labor. And here, of course, I will just mention 2 important concepts: gig economy, which represents the whole system in the media sector, and precariat, which is the modern proletariat of the communication and media industry. Well, now it's time to talk about the future. As I told you, I'm going to speculate, of course, for the future, and I will try to use the concept from Bourdieu, his famous 2 concepts, the field and the agent. And in this perspective, I label the communication and media field as a network in which there are agents, human and non-humans. When I'm talking the agents, I basically mean the journalists, the news, the newspapers, the content in general, the media industry in general, technology, and the journalism and rating. I'm going to talk about the journalism and the rating system in particular. So I'm going to give the examples from this. Well, what is journalism today? Well, it used to be the news as fact during the 19th and 20th century. But now, are we able to talk about the news as facts? 5W and 1H is still valid? I put a question mark. Gatekeeping. Are the journalists in general, have the position of gatekeeping still, or somebody else, even the citizens, or even the mafia members are gatekeepers? I put a question mark here too. Well, we're talking about the investigative journalism. I find it always a contradiction, as if it is possible to make journalism without investigation. It's not possible, but still we needed this term after 1990s, because the journalism was getting worse, and as a new term, investigative journalism was coined. Is it still possible to get the news as something new? So, as the name suggests, news is actually the newest content. Therefore, we have the names Daily, Telegram, or Actual News, things like that. And is it still possible to have the news as it is the newest form? I have to put a question mark on that as well. The rapidness has lots of problems with the introduction of new technology. Of course, journalism is always lagging behind. Even television, I personally observe many television anchormen looking at their mobile phones while they're presenting television. So they are getting the newest news from their mobile phone, from internet journalism, or from Twitter journalism as well, even from Sedat Peker journalism, I would call it. And what about the news? I put a question mark on that as well in a post-truth area. While we all applauded the introduction of fact-checking sites, which is actually against the conventional journalism. Is it possible to make journalism with the fact-checking, indulging in the preparation of the news and the dissemination of the news? I put a question mark on that. Now, I will basically talk about the relationship between the data journalism and leak journalism, which are, of course, the new concepts. And data journalism is somehow the future of journalism. We cannot escape from this in the forms of artificial intelligence journalism and in the form of somehow big data journalism. However, we observed the huge impact from the leak journalism. Therefore, we are having a transition period from journalism to leak journalism, and probably we're going to have a data journalism. But this requires a struggle among the data processing systems. Should it be leaked by someone so that we go on with the leak journalism, or we, the citizens, the audience, will have the possibility to reach to the data sources? So this is a big struggle, and this requires the new political conceptualizations, which is behind this presentation. Therefore, this is the struggle between the states and big tech companies, and it's a big issue with the artificial intelligence. And finally, I'm going to talk about another important concept for the media industry in general, which is measuring. There's a famous quote from Lord Kelvin, who said, if you cannot measure, you cannot know. So this is the basis for positivism. Measuring is something very important in the classical conventional media. The old system, as we all know, it's television based. We have those people meters connected to the televisions, and it collects data, and we know what kind of people watched what kind of programs. This is the old rating system. But now it is changing. It has already changed. And we have a new measurement system. And for the moment, it is the new system of click and impressions. It is still with the quantity. However, I think it is going to be the time for a transition from measuring quantity to the quality, or quantity and quality together. So this is a question mark again, and it is obvious that we have the transition from mass media rating system to more personalized new media rating system. And instead of measuring the quantity, we're not yet at the point of measuring the quality, how quality listening is possible. We are not able to measure it yet, but we are in the transition period from measuring quantity to measuring effectiveness. And I will just name one important event, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica event, in which it is we understood that it is possible to measure the effectiveness of our communication. We call it a scandal. Of course, it's a scandal in the classical terms, but I think it will be an interesting example for understanding the future. So for the future, the whole measurement system, which is, of course, the basis of the system, how are we going to finance? Will the advertising industry be able to go on like this, like as it is? So everything is changing, and I think the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal has some clues what to expect for the future. And in conclusion, I'll return back to Marx again from a quote from his The Poverty of Philosophy. He said, quote, "The handmill gives you the society with the feudal lord, and the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist." He says that with the change in the mode of production, the technology accompanies. Well, it's not to claim that Marx was a techno-determinist, it's not. But he said actually, new technology will accompany the new order, the new mode of production. So with the feudal mode of production, we have a certain type of technology, and with the industrial capitalism, we have a more developed technology. From this, in summary, we can say that new technologies will accompany the new communication and media order. So there's no help from technologies. They may facilitate, they may make it speedier, the change, but actually the net technologies will only accompany the new communication and media order. So old system is dying. Journalism is dying. Journalists are dying. Gatekeeping concept is dying. TV-based rating system is dying. Even probably we don't have journalism departments later. However, the new system have not yet completely born. Well, we have some clues: artificial intelligence journalism, multimedia content, collaborative technologies. We have open source, open data, which are very promiseful, but still we're going to see shocking symptoms in the future, and we will see more morbid symptoms as stated by Gramsci. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if I explained myself clearly, and if we have any suggestions or critiques and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Atabek. If you could stop sharing the slides so that we could see people. Right. So thank you again for this really illuminating perspective, a journey, I would say, from old to new. I find it really interesting because your paper have defined the future as yet to happen. In other words, there's still something to come. So I opened the panel and our participants, the forum part of our keynote speech. So I will try to collect questions from chat box. I guess that is the best way to do. And I appreciate if people could write their names next to their questions, because sometimes you have like names like iPhone on Zoom. So please don't give us a hard time and give your names. So any questions from either our panelists or from participants? I have questions, but I don't want to abuse my role here as the moderator. All right. Is this a question? Yes, I guess. So I will have to translate the question by Ferah. Sorry. Ferah talks about how journalists cannot practice their job recently, and actually the attention is drawn to Sedat Peker videos. I don't name it as journalism, but it's a videos. So maybe we could question the end of our end of journalism as a profession. So will it end, or will it come back in a stronger way? Sorry for terrible translation, but that is all I could do. I guess Ümit Hoca could also read the question in Turkish from chat box. So please keep your questions coming, and I give the floor to Ümit Hoca to answer. If journalism is ending in the face of this development by Sedat Peker videos, which is, I guess, watched by the entire Turkish population over the age of 9 as of today. So Ümit Hoca, what do you say? Will journalism end?
Well, of course, nothing ends, but we know that from the definition from Gramsci, the crisis ends at a certain point. Although, according to Marx, it is repetitive. There will be more crises like this from period to period. However, we're going to have a new kind of balanced situation in which we still need the news in a way. We need the content, but I don't know if it is still be labeled as, in quotation, journalism. And those who are going to produce the content, which is suitable for the needs of the news, for the needs of information of the masses, of the audiences. And I don't know if we're going to still continue to label this as journalism. As we all know, journalism, the word journalism is a modern term. In the whole history of humanity, it existed only in a very limited time. Probably we don't have the name as journalists because they have nothing to do with journal anymore. Although we have an internet site with journal, a name with journal, but it has nothing to do with the day. It is even faster. And back to Sedat Peker journalism, it is, well, it's not a good journalism, of course. When we label something as journalism, we always somehow put it in the excellent way. If it is something in the standards, then it's called journalism. But please, let's see the real journalism. Takvim, for instance, in Turkey, is it journalism? If it is journalism, Sedat Peker is also journalism. I'm using the term in that sense. Of course, there are lots of things to criticize for this kind of journalism. But in any way, I will see that the future will be, of course, with the news, but not in this form, in the form of today's news. It will be more content production, something like that. First of all, it will be, in any case, a multimedia news. That means that we need not so-called the journalists, but the multimedia content producers. Their technical will be like this. And I don't know, there will be a buzzwords for that later, but the journalists will appreciate, and let me say within 20 years, the word journalism will be used less.
Okay, thanks very much. Actually, the owner of the question had made a little correction, but about that, I didn't ask about Sedat Peker, but the answer was not totally about Sedat Peker anyway. So I will just follow the chat box questions in order. So there's a question that, it is a question about the use of Karl Marx in Ümit Hoca's presentation. I'm really having terrible time in translating the question, so I will rather interpret the question, if I may say so. So, was Karl Marx a technological determinist? My interpretation is that he was not, to tell you the truth, because it says later on term, he didn't have that term at that time. But anyhow, so Ümit Hoca, you see the question, don't you? In the chat box. Let me say it in Turkish, with my apologies to the non-Turkish speaking participants. Marx teknolojik determinist miydi yoksa tarihin teknolojik dönüşüm bilimlerinde medyaya emekçiyi destekleyen bir işlevsellik mi atfediyordu? I don't have any question to this question. Ümit Hoca, do you have a question? Answer, sorry.
Well, the answer is included in the question, I think. As you have said, that Marx was not a techno-determinist, but he used technology as a tool for detailing the change from one mode of production to the other. So technology is a very important concept, and it organizes many things, including the production process as well. But it doesn't per se change it. It is the organization of the production by the labor. So there is a mode of production in which we have the labor, but the technology is not an external power to come and change the whole production process. It's not like this. So I think the question is includes the answer. It's not, and it puts this explanation of Marx puts an functionality to the changing process. But I wouldn't say that it is a contribution to the functionality of the labor. This is something else. We need more discussion on that. But I believe that the technology contributed to the more exploitation during the transition period. Therefore, it's about the transition period explanation.
Thank you very much. So there's a question that I skipped. It's coming from Samaya Hamidova. Do you think capitalism is managed like feudalism? I interpret this as contemporary capitalism, I guess. So what do you say, Ümit?
Could you repeat that? I couldn't understand.
Do you think capitalism is managed like feudalism? So it's, in order to have a question not involving, not to have it involve terms in contradiction, I rewrite the question as contemporary capitalism instead of capitalism. Is contemporary capitalism is like feudalism? And Samaya just added a note. Journalism is the foremost profession of capitalism. Management diversity makes us question which direction journalism is heading. Yeah, so that is the opening up.
Let me talk about the capitalism in the form of feudalism, refeudalization, as explained by I forgot his name. This famous Frankfurt School scholar who wrote about it.
Shall I name names? Adorno,
the last one.
Marcuse, Habermas.
Habermas. The refeudalization is the discussion started by him. Well, yes, there is always a refeudalization in contemporary capitalism, but this is a more complex issue. Well, also classical Orthodox Marxism has dealt with this in the sense that there is a transformation problem from one mode to the other, and there's always an articulation problem. So in any case, even in the purest form of capitalist mode of production, there are always some portions from the feudal system. So they are not 100% inseparable. In this sense, I would say that yes, we observe some feudal aspects in the so-called modern capitalism, but still it is the modern capitalism in its highest form, even its imperialism.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. There is a question by Turan Novruzova. Are we expecting to have artificial intelligence and related concepts to be taught in the universities, I guess in journalism schools? Is there a digital perspective entering the scene? So that is my translation.
Well, instead of giving this answer from the perspective of the journalism, I would rather prefer to the academia. As you all know, there is a new university called YouTube University, and it's a threat to us. And we have to deal with this feature. And if you apply this to journalism, well, journalism is in danger. It will disappear in the sense that we have today. There will be, for instance, the photojournalists. Are there any employment in even the biggest newspapers?
I think the question is more about should we or shall we add a digital perspective to that education? So to perhaps, in your terms, compete with YouTube University.
Unfortunately, I was always insisting that mathematics should be one of the basic courses in communication education, and my colleagues hated me, and the students would never accept this. But without mathematics, it's not possible to get any kind of profession. Well, I'm not saying that artificial intelligence, I'm not saying that electronics or anything like that, but mathematics is the basis of all those new programming life. And 500 years ago in Bologna University, which is well applauded by many academicians in Turkey, according to the Bologna University, a person should always know some levels of mathematics in order to be a good citizen.
All right. So I will try to wrap the first Q&A session in 5 minutes, actually. So I will enter here Professor Irvan's question, and I thank him for asking it in English. So Süleyman Hoca says, what kind of future he assumes, I mean, Professor Atabek assumes for the profession? Should we stop teaching quality journalism? That was my question, but it has been talked quite a lot, right, Ümit Hocam? But maybe you could just put a final full stop to that discussion.
Well, what is quality journalism? Can he name, for instance, Cumhuriyet as a quality journalism today? Well, 20 years ago, when I was obtaining data from empirical research, I was choosing Cumhuriyet as quality journal and Star as yellow journalism. That was easy. But today, is it possible to name really a name for quality journalism? Quality journalism involves objectivity. It requires few visuals.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we're still agreeing with the standards. I have some doubts, which is, of course, behind my capacity. It's a very important question. But I think we should be following the change in the paradigm in which we will have to redefine the standards. What is a quality professor? I asked to Professor Irvan.
I have a definition for quality professor.
That's you, Professor.
I see three faces at least as the definition of quality professors. So maybe one last. There are more questions coming up, but I will leave that to the perhaps if you have time at the end of the entire keynote panel. So. There's this, maybe we could tie this latest discussion to Erva's question, and citing Aldous Huxley, he mentions, or she mentions, I don't know, her or him, mentions let me see, unnecessary information C. This is a Huxley, I guess. So when there's such a intense bombardment of information, data, how can we reach the real information, real knowledge? What is the cleanest way to reach that from the perspective of journalism and media? So there's an intense bombardment. There's a huge amount of information or data flowing around. So how can we find a way to do real knowledge or real information, Professor Atabek?
Well, this is a very huge question in which I have no capacity to answer. But what I'm trying to say is that the real information, the word "real" is in quotation, but in order to be real, I think it is needed to be the free information or open information in that sense. Therefore, I think if we're going to follow something politically, it will be the freeness or the openness of data, not controlled by those states previously and now by big tech giant companies, corporate information, and nor by the gatekeepers. I think if we eliminate all those three groups of information controllers, then information becomes free and open, which is available in a way. So it is still possible to make, even within this transition period, with the open data.
Okay.
Although they are not labeled as open data. I'm not talking about the hacking journalism or things like that, but I'm talking about the responsibility of those who are intending the role of journalists have to look for the data which is already available. And this data should be interpreted as the source for free and open information.
Thank you so very much, Professor Atabek. That last answer actually have become partly the answer to Burak Toraman's question. So I appreciate your time and your effort in both
there are
presenting.
many good questions which I couldn't even touch. I'm sorry for that.
Are there? Am I missing good questions? But let me do as I say. Let me wrap this part of keynote panel at this point and move on to our next speaker, Greg Simmons, if he's around. Oh, he is. Well, Greg, hello again. My plan in my head is to kind of finish up in time all our three keynote speakers, and if we have time in the very end, after Greg answers his questions, then we may have an open discussion within the limits given to us to conduct this panel. So Greg Simmons is from Uppsala University, and let me try to introduce Greg to our participants, listeners. This is easier, I must say, than Professor Atabek, because hopefully we will become friends from now on, but I don't know Greg in person. So I will stick to my notes if you allow me. So Greg is a graduate of University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Associate Professor Greg Simmons is currently a researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University, also a lecturer at the Department of Communication Science and leading researcher at the Business Technology Institute at Turiba University in Riga, Latvia, and a leading researcher at the Humanitarian Institute at Ural Federal University in Yekaterinburg, Russia. He's on a senior editorial board of the Journal for Political Marketing. His research interests include changing political dynamics and relationships, mass media, public diplomacy, political marketing, crisis management, communications, media and armed conflict, and the Russian Orthodox Church. He also researches the relationships and connections between information politics and armed conflict more broadly, such as GWOT and Arab Spring. He has quite a long list of publications. I'm not going to go through them. I think our keynote speakers' CVs are also available in the conference website. So this is basically what I will say in terms of presenting Greg, and he will be talking on a very interesting topic, which I think relates to the Turkish context of COVID-19 to a certain extent. So the title of Greg's presentation is Digital Resistance to the Official Coronavirus Lockdown Narrative Seen Through the Crisis Communication Lens. So, Greg, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, and after we will get the questions. Please.
Okay, thanks for the very thorough introduction. So, okay, I've got a relatively provocative title, but before I go into the meat of this empirics, just to clarify a couple of points, and especially around the issue of crisis and then crisis communication from a theoretical model, and enables you to see how what's happening today fits in with these conceptual ideas of how these operate. So Umut spoke somewhat about crisis. I'm speaking from a more communicational point of view, but nonetheless, what is a crisis? And a crisis, of course, is understood as being an extraordinary situation. So that is something above and beyond what is considered to be a normal event. And this usually involves three simultaneously present elements in order to be able to define it as a crisis. If there are two or less of these elements, it is less than a crisis. So it is considered. So the first point is that it is a threat to values. So this creates things like threat to human life, threat to state security, threats to identity. It can be a number of different things. It can also be a threat to land or property, these kinds of things. The second point is the unpredictability. So it's not understood where a crisis is going because it starts and it creates a lot of uncertainty about things. And the third point is that there is time constraint. So this is the basic idea that the longer a crisis continues, the more damage is done, and the more damage that is done, it is more difficult to get to mitigate the effects. And so, I mean, this is in part, we're focusing on those physical parts, but as is understood, that a crisis also brings about a political call for action. So there's a kind of mobilization, political mobilization in order to face a crisis. And to do this, this needs to be understood within the context that when a physical crisis occurs, you have a physical crisis here, but parallel to that physical crisis, you have a crisis of information. And so the implications of a crisis of information is that an actor that is able to control or to manipulate those flows of information that circulate around a particular crisis are better able to manage the crisis situation. But if they do not, then it becomes problematic, including the operational aspects become more problematic because this is these informational aspects to a crisis, they are dictating and influencing how the crisis is perceived, and consequently how the public or different people react to it based on their opinions formed from that information. Now, when we're talking about a crisis, there's usually this association. A crisis is something bad, it's something negative, which generally it is. However, it's not bad and negative for everyone, because there are those that are able to manage and manipulate the situation of a crisis to their own advantage. And this is quite often done in crises, owing to what I just mentioned not so long ago about these political dimensions of a crisis. And that a crisis is not only a threat, but for some, it's also an opportunity. And this can be seen within the current context, because we're talking about the corona virus pandemic as being this physical crisis, that is a health-related crisis. But in addition to that, there is what has been largely called an infodemic, an information epidemic. So this is the crisis of information which is circulating around the coronavirus pandemic. Now, so this particular virus pandemic is not, the problem about the informational aspect is not a lack of information, it is an overabundance of information. And consequently, this is problematic because you've got these political and opportunistic dimensions which are coming into the crisis, especially the crisis communication. So if we look at it, some of the general approaches are that there has been a gradual move to what I refer to as forming an orthodoxy of knowledge. And so what is an orthodoxy of knowledge? That is an agreed upon reality. So this is, if you like, a consensus which is created, which may be partly based on selective scientific evidence, but is also got the political and social dimensions added to it as well. And this shuts out alternative views. So you got what is called a gradual spiral of silence. So you start with a very wide discussion and understanding, and it gradually narrows down. And this can be seen if we look, for example, back in March last year, where you had this discussion whether it was so-called herd immunity versus lockdown. So you had different understandings of what is the best approach. Gradually, the lockdown became the more favored or more practiced method by different governments. The Swedish government in this regard was one of the outliers, which did not issue a lockdown. So you have other governments such as South Korea, which also had a similar approach. So what happens when you get an outlier? Then the problem becomes one of political legitimacy, what is seen as legitimate and what is not seen as illegitimate. Because the British government, although they started, for example, with adhering to a more herd immunity approach, were soon put under significant pressure and then began to follow the lockdown approach and have followed that ever since. Now, when we're talking about different types of media, there is, you can see even historically how media means of communication have developed. These have quite often began as being some kind of bastion of freedom of expression, an ability to break out of the traditional gatekeepers and have a greater level of freedom. And I mean, this has been done every time there has been a new form of mass communication. If we look at the role of newspapers, for example, radio, the same, the initial idea that it's a medium of communication that will create a sort of liberty of humanity. The same with television, and until more recently, this was the idea of understanding of social media. However, there are those that have always taken a somewhat critical approach to this understanding. And Evgeny Morozov, for example, stated that this idea of an open and democratic space created by social media is a facade, because it can always be tooled and re-engineered to exactly the opposite. So a closed space, non-democratic. And if we look at this pandemic, it has been variously regarded as a black swan event. So that is something which is very large, destructive, but not very common. Although there are those who have argued against it. But certainly, regardless of whether you refer to the coronavirus as a black swan event or not, there have been at least 3 very discernible effects and processes which have been initiated by this virus. And the first one is that it has increased geopolitical competition significantly. And this geopolitical competition has come at a time when you have the unipolar US-led Western world, which is in a relative state of decline for various reasons, being challenged by a more multipolar non-Western world, which is the challenger. And one can see this has intensified now. So, I mean, although before the coronavirus, there were these geopolitical tensions, for example, the West with Russia and the US, especially with China, that this has actually been intensifying now. And this has been a thing which has been exacerbated by the virus times. And because this is coming into the point that it's not only a threat to some actors, but it's also an opportunity to others. So there is a juggling and jostling for position and advantage, which is coming out of the crisis. The second point is that there's been a massive redistribution of wealth. So the rich have got much richer, the poor have become much poorer. And if we look at the figures in the United States, the top richest in the US have earned an extra over $3 trillion as a result, during the virus times. And the poorest, the bottom poorest in the United States have lost around $3 trillion. So you've had a massive redistribution of wealth. And one thing which has become apparent is that, for example, lockdowns, which the World Health Organization advised against, or they advised that this should be an absolute last resort rather than a standard practice, because they anticipated that it would exacerbate the inequalities of wealth within the countries. And one can see that in the United Kingdom at the moment. The poor have got much poorer. The United States, the same. And New Zealand, which is held as a good example, the the poor have become poorer, and child poverty, etc., has become a bigger problem as a result of the government policies, which are no longer subjected to the usual oversight and scrutiny. And a third aspect or process which is observable is that there has been a massive decline of individual rights and freedoms. And these are especially in so-called democratic countries, where the use of fear. Now, fear is operationalizable if that people believe something bad can happen. So, for example, that there's a virus and something bad can happen to them personally, so that they can catch the virus. And if these two are together, then this has created the perception of this virus as being something very deadly. And the basic cognitive effect of this informational stream is that people are more readily willing to accept a trade-off where they trade their freedom and liberty for a sense of security, even if that security is a false sense of security. And this is seen very clearly, for example, in Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia. They're in another lockdown at the moment, in spite of the fact that every other lockdown which they've had has not worked. So, because they're still practicing the same technique at the moment. Now, but this is not expressed clearly in the mainstream media. So mainstream media tend to support the government narrative, and whether it be New Zealand, United Kingdom, etc. And so this leaves social media as an alternative avenue to get out the message. And so have this alternative narrative, which has been essentially shut out from mainstream media. And this is very clear. However, like all of these previous forms of media, which were seen as being beacons of freedom and liberty, the authorities or the particular power structure soon adapts to the new media and co-opts them. And so there is a very observable point where there is a migration and inequality which has crept into the different types or outlets of social media, if you call them this. So you have the likes of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which are that have moved away from this notion that they're a platform, a neutral platform to express opinions, views, information, to one that is policed subjectively. And so this has created the situation where you're having kind of social media dissidents, if you want to call them that are moving to other social media that are not owned by what are loosely called big tech, such as moving away from those platforms from which are now becoming more closely aligned to the official government narrative, like Facebook and Twitter and so forth. And this is interesting how these dynamics are working in these narratives. Because, for example, you would see on social media things which you do not see in mainstream media. If we look at the recent protests and in London, for example, against the lockdown, where you had tens of thousands, if not more, people that were streaming in the street protesting against lockdown. This was the BBC said a couple of hundred people protested. Other media, the mainstream media, chose to ignore it completely. So this is a crisis communication mechanism when something does not go according to the true narrative, and I'm saying that this is the subjective narrative, then there are two ways to address it: either to ignore the event or to try and explain away the event, why it is not significant. So there were attempts to label and characterize those protesters as anti-vaxxers, as conspiracy theorists, these kinds of things. However, if you looked at some of the accounts on social media, then you actually see the real numbers. You actually see video footage of these very large crowds protesting. And so this has been one thing. The use of police force, which has been not shown on mainstream media during lockdowns, but it has been shown on social media. So this is showing this lack of democracy, transparency, accountability on the part of the authorities, which is not being addressed by those that still refer to themselves as the fourth estate. Now, there are also interesting contradictions which are showing up. So, for example, some of the main architects of the lockdown, for example, the chief scientist for the British government, Ferguson, who is one of the main proponents and those architects of the British lockdown policy, yet he violated his own lockdown policy to meet a married woman who was his mistress, thereby breaking his own lockdown policy to do so. And he is still the chief scientist. So you've got this disparity. I mean, the same thing can be said for New Zealand. You had the last year, the Minister of Health, who is enforcing lockdown and telling people to be responsible, etc., etc. And then, while he was lecturing the New Zealand public to do this, what did he do? He took a vacation on the beach with his family. So you've got these complete and utter disparities which are not held to account. Now, this idea of lockdown, for example, this is played down a little bit, and the actual effects of the lockdown are not really accounted for on mainstream media. So, I mean, if you do something like this, there is an opportunity cost. So, and this opportunity cost is, for example, the devastation of one's economy, or the disruption of society, including access to necessary medical and health services. So, for example, there is very little being said concerning those people that are not able to access preventative medicine. So they cannot be tested for cancer. They cannot be have access to the necessary surgery to address medical issues. And hence, those people are slipping between the cracks. There is also, this is being more addressed in certain social media accounts. So you have a number of social media celebrities, or at least sort of key influencers that are emerging on social media because of this lack of transparency and accountability by this mainstream media. And people, it's also divided society between, well, we can broadly say those who are for the lockdown and these restrictive measures as being COVIDians, named after the branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas. So this kind of radical believers. It's a derogatory comment, but also those who do not believe in the lockdown and other such measures, or the vaccine, for example. These are referred to as anti-vaxxers or conspiracy theorists, these other terms, which do not address the actual issue, but attack the character of the speaker rather than the substance of what the speaker is saying. Now, when we look at how this operates, a number of these people who are speaking out are not advocating a different approach, accumulating a rather large following, but this has created tension within social media, especially those controlled by what are referred to as big tech companies, because this is problematic for the official narrative. And so there is an active censorship which is currently underway on social media, and especially, as I mentioned, on those particular ones such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, where you have fact checkers which are censoring and in some cases banning people or personalities that are speaking out against the official narrative, even if these people who are speaking out are more than adequately qualified in terms of their qualifications, but also experience. And you've even had people who are formerly advising the American Center for Disease Control that are being censored and banned from social media for fake news. But at the same time, this fake news, it's shifted in how fake news is used and how it's defined and understood and operationalized. Because if we look back around 20 years, fake news was something contrived or made up. And this included satire, talk shows, and the like. If we bring it forward about 5 or 10 years, then it became something which was manipulative and deceptive in nature. And this was associated with Russian hybrid warfare or these kinds of terms, but it's something deceptive and manipulative, and deliberately so. And if we move to the era of Trump, then fake news became something which was considered to be a worldview. And if your worldview did not coincide with what was being told by a media organization, then it was fake news. So Trump calling CNN fake news, for example, because he did not agree with what they were saying. But now fake news has been operationalized as something of a label, but it's a very elusive label, but it's being used to censor. And so this is one of the problematic issues, because the narrative of the coronavirus is being one which is based on the notion of consensus. Now, consensus does not equate to being the truth. It's just people, for whatever reason, agree on a certain point at a certain time, which can change. And so this is the problem, because one of these slogans, of which there are different slogans used by the different sides, are being used to shape this, to manipulate, where it becomes an interpretation. The information realm becomes an interpretation, a very, what should we say, generous interpretation of the so-called reality of the physical realm. And this has been done to shape what people do think and how they do react. And this is clearly evident in the current times. And you've got these ideas where, I mean, George Creel, the head of the Committee for Public Information, which was the organization which was key to shifting American public opinion to enter the First World War in 1917. He said that catchphrases and slogans are the things that motivate humanity. And so you have catchphrases. So, for example, there's Build Back Better, and these new realities which are being projected, which are quite Orwellian in their nature. And one can see that, media have done an appalling job in actually serving public interest. And similarly, big tech control of social media has been shown to be similarly destructive in terms of public interest and public good. So I will finish there because I think my 30 minutes is up. So open for Q&A.
Thank you, Greg, for your presentation. It's been a very interesting presentation on my part, at least, especially removing the cloud over the pandemic as a untouchable information space, and in terms of relating it to current political and economic realities like poverty or freedom of speech and so on and so forth. It's been a very, very interesting talk with a very wide range of examples from UK, New Zealand, and Australia, and US, and so on. So I already have a bunch of questions to pass on to you, Professor. But before that, I would like to welcome Simon Cottle. He's with us now, though there he is.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, and welcome. So let me turn back to Greg's presentation and related questions. Let me try to go through the chat. Here is a question from Begüm Burak. Here it is. How did the uneven wealth distribution shape vaccination efforts globally? As you noted earlier, the rich people got richer. Maybe they also control the health industry and medical industry.
Well, yes, there are different vested interests, because if you look at the top billionaires, I mean, for example, Bill Gates and his investment in the pharmaceuticals, or where you got the owner of Amazon, who is an essential industry. So these, which is very convenient because that cuts out your competition, which are non-essential industries. So, I mean, it definitely benefited them. And these people are quite often very supportive of these lockdown measures because they benefit financially from it, not only in terms of things which you think are obvious, such as any profits which may be brought about from sale of vaccines, but also the so-called essential industries, whether it be food deliveries, whether it be this mail order books and products and different things. They've done very well, and you can understand why. And this has been definitely one of the things. Whereas ordinary people cannot get out to work. And I mean, you had a number of stories in the US where people were borrowing and were maxing their credit cards just to pay the rent because they had no access to work, let alone a wage or a salary. So, I mean, this has just created this wider and wider gap. And I mean, it's predictably so. But I mean, one can say that this, I mean, it's widened the gap, which has already been caused by these economic shocks from the earlier in the 2000s, so 2008 and so forth. So it's exacerbating a number of existing problems.
Okay. Here's another question by Zehra Aydın. She asks an interesting question, actually, a Baudrillardian question, maybe I could say. Would there be a pandemic had we not have a media component? Can you answer this question, comparing it to earlier pandemics in history, where we did not have such a widespread social media and media outlets, information flow, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems in this particular pandemic and the media contribution to that is how they contribute to the information. Because, okay, it's not only in terms of the quantity of information, but it's also the quality of information. So, for example, I mean, you've had previous pandemics and epidemics, SARS, these bird flu, swine flu, and other kinds of flu, but there was not this massive fixation on the measure of the deadliness, if we want to put it that way. So we have media which are focusing on the infection rate. That is how quickly the virus spreads from person to person. This is not how deadly it is, it's how quickly it spreads. However, and if we look at that, it spreads very quickly. However, if we look at the infection fatality rate, which is what the medical profession uses, they don't use the infection rate, they use the infection fatality rate, then it's much lower. And even the WHO is saying, with their statistics, this is a very non-fatal disease if you compare it to previous epidemics and pandemics. I mean, it spreads much quicker, but you're much less likely to die from it. So it's what I think was 0.3 or something like this. So 3 people in every 1,000 that get it can die with it or of it. And this is not clarified whether they die with it or of it. And so compare that to, for example, Ebola, which is much more restricted in its spread, but it's around 67%. So it's a much higher. If you catch it, you're much more likely to die of it. Even though if we take into account it's a completely different biological organism.
Yeah.
And also that the point is that these contributing factors are not taken into account. So people who die with the coronavirus, it makes it look as though they're dying of it. And I mean, one of the most ridiculous cases was when a motorcyclist who crashed and died in the crash in Florida was declared as dying of the coronavirus. I mean, he had it, but this wasn't the cause of death. And also other factors like areas of high air pollution, because this affects the ability of the lungs capacity. So in parts of China or northern Italy, for example, where you had high death rates, this was one of the factors which contributed to that. It wasn't solely that, but also old age, because Italy was one of the examples. And I mean, they have an older population, so a more susceptible one. And if we look at places like Victoria in Australia, I mean, the basis of their one of their lockdowns, I mean, they continually go into them, was that I think it was 7 or 8 people died with coronavirus. What they were less inclined to mention was that the age of these people were in the 70s to 80s, and that all but, I think, two maximum of them, everyone else had advanced Alzheimer's. So, I mean, it's a lot of not very transparent reporting, which has elevated this perception of risk of death. And this is the thing, it's a value, human life. Most people do not want to die. And so, yeah. And other health statistics have disappeared. I mean, you just get a sole emphasis on people with coronavirus. So it's created like this big, massive filter bubble, which exacerbates the sense of risk.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's intriguing to hear statistics from WHO that the number of deaths could be 3 million or 9 million. So there's this very interesting, variance between the numbers and actual predicted numbers. So I would like to move on to the other questions and ask Greg to give shorter answers so that we could cover more questions. Some of them are tied to each other. For instance, one that's coming from Metehan Gürdal is that how can we avoid fake news in times of crisis? How effective is banning personal or corporate accounts on social media?
Well, in short, it's hard to avoid fake news because this is a very large event. So it's going to draw a lot of attention, including fake news. So you will not avoid it. And in fact, you're more likely to encounter it. So the best thing to do is to look at other alternative sources. For example, former journalists who have gone into the industry by themselves as independents. So, for example, Trish Wood is one such journalist who moved from mainstream to independent. And, for example, she interviews a lot of people on the coronavirus that are not interviewed by the mainstream. So it's a matter of information literacy and being able to navigate these particular information spaces.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question by Professor Atabek. He asks, if you observe, Professor Simmons, observe any differences between Western and non-Western practices in terms of their approaches to the pandemic management?
I observe national differences because, this is the point. Crisis is very political in nature. So the Swedish government promotes this herd immunity or this non-lockdown approach because that's the path they've taken. The British government have their hand forced and they have this lockdown approach. Well, the Russian government, for example, they became somewhere in between because they especially around time of elections, which is politically sensitive, they become less restrictive. And so you can also see the differences in the approach to vaccines, where you get this this kind of virus nationalism and vaccine diplomacy, if you want to call it that. So, I mean, you got the government narrative operates at different levels, national as well as international. So it's quite a complex one. You need to find out what is the policy of the government, and then you'll see what is, you understand why the narrative of the mainstream media is what it is.
Okay, so we are approaching to the end of our time. So I apologize if I couldn't cover all the questions. Thank you for the those who asked. But I'd like to combine two questions which I find really interesting. The question, one question deals with global COVID-19 crisis, big data, storages of social media companies, crypto money system. All these marks are the signs of end of national government system. Are these the end of marks of the end of national government system? Which is coming next? Which administrative system is coming? One question asks, and I really a shrunken format of the same question. Will the world be the same after the pandemic? that is
okay.
a.
So I mean,
this is by Galaxy.
Second...
This is the last one was by Hülya Deveci. I don't have the name for the first one. Yeah, please go.
Well, the second question is quite interesting because they're trying to promote this slogan, the new normal. So, I mean, this means that they're trying to massage people to expect something different and to accept it as normal, even though it is obviously not normal, especially if you look in the so-called fine print of what constitutes this so-called new normal. So yeah, there is an attempt to do that. That's why you're getting more and more people starting to mobilize against this idea of a new normal. And this is coming back to what I told you about what George Creel said. I mean, they're trying to use slogans and catchphrases to prime and mobilize. Now, the first question, is there going to be, well, actually, if you look at how national governments function as opposed to international organizations, the international ones were a disaster. I mean, the WHO, the European Union was completely and utterly incompetent and performing even below my low expectations of their ability to perform.
It was anything but union, right, Greg? Anything but union.
Yeah, and I mean, solidarity, and then all of a sudden, oh, Italy, you want help? No, we can't do that. So this is when you had Russia, China, and Cuba helping Italy. And so, I mean, this is the so-called nationalism and this virus nationalism and these vaccine diplomacy. No, I mean, if anything, it's really undermined the legitimacy of these international organizations and sort of reinforce and reentrench the relevance of national governments in some cases.
Okay, thank you so very much. And thank you to both keynote speakers for using time very efficiently so that we have enough time for Simon Cottle. Simon, welcome again. In the organizing talks, we talked about presentations roughly about 30 minutes long, and then we are taking Q&A, questions and answers from the audience. So let me try to introduce Professor Cottle very shortly so that he will have more time for presentation and questions. Simon Cottle is a professor of media and communications at the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University, where he was formerly head of school and deputy head of school. Previously, he was inaugural chair and head of media and communications program at the University of Melbourne. And he holds honorary positions at various universities in other countries. He is currently director of a research group at Cardiff, which is called Communications, Human Security, and Atrocity in Global Context. He has many books. I'm not going to name the books to save the time, but his current involvement is interesting. I'd like to mention that. Actually, Professor Cottle is the series editor of The Global Crisis and the Media, published by Peter Lang, a series of 20 plus research monographs and edited volumes. So it's quite appropriate information, I guess, as per his talk. And his presentation is titled COVID-19, a wake-up call. But who is listening? So, Simon, the floor is yours, and you have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Professor Dr. Suleiman Övan, and also Dean Professor Nazif Gunga for the kind invitation to join your conference on crisis reporting and crisis journalism. This is something I've thought about for many years. I'm not an expert on pandemics. I put my hand up straight away to say that, but I am interested in the way in which the pandemic can, and I believe normatively should be seen as a wake-up call to the world in a way that I will try to elaborate in my 30 minutes or so. The question is, I think, who's listening? And if we're not listening, why aren't we listening? So if you just give me a minute, and I'm going to try and get my PowerPoint up. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, it is quite visible.
Good, great, thank you. Okay, so reporting COVID-19 in a world in crisis. This is my opening sort of gambit, really. It's something I've been working on now for the last 10 years or so, in terms of what I see as the necessity to try and better understand the way in which many of the crises that we confront in the world now are global in nature. They are globally, potentially in encompassing terms. And the role of media and communications with them has become, I think, increasingly critical for reasons that we can discuss a little bit later. So here's my opening statement. We're living in an unprecedented time in human history that presages world civilizational collapse. It's in this context that we must now begin to rethink, along with so much else, our critical stance to global crisis reporting, including the reporting of the global pandemic, COVID-19. Well, that's what I'm going to come to. What I want to do first is just to say a little bit about what I see and perceive on the research agenda for people working in my field, particularly in media and communications, in respect of COVID-19. And what I'm about to say isn't necessarily a criticism or indeed a critique of that research agenda, which contains many, many important and indeed I would say essential ways of interrogating COVID-19 and its media representation. But nevertheless, I would see it as insufficient to where we are in the world today. So let me just very quickly run through, if you will, what I see as being on the research agenda in terms of looking at people's talks at various conferences and forthcoming publications and various research initiatives and so on. I mean, firstly and foremost, perhaps, and for obvious reasons, COVID-19 is seen as a public health crisis in which communications is central. So there's a lot of effort exploring the way in which information and educating wider populations to the risks of COVID-19 and so on, as well as the role that communications can play in countering some of those myths that are clearly destructive to people's well-being, and also in terms of facilitating public health initiatives. So that's what we would normally expect, I think, in terms of exploring academic approaches to public health crises, and for good reason. Secondly, we might then want to go a little bit, if not deeper, perhaps a little bit more epistemologically into the way in which knowledge is socially constructed and circulated, and the different types of knowledge that media and communications can circulate and deliver. So, you know, some of the key agencies, key actors are going to be science and health professionals and experts, politicians and publics, and of course the role of the media themselves and the public translation of that knowledge in terms of what we know and how we know this knowledge. And as I think the previous speaker was, you know, alluding to, there are competing and contending claims, and claims to truth are very often seen to be less certain than we might possibly believe when we first encounter them, because of the essential way in which knowledge is being constructed through different institutions with its different interests and its different epistemological underpinnings. We might also want to explore, and colleagues of mine are, the way in which political deliberation and policy formulation and government scrutiny is also a key part of media and communications. And this is kind of the classic public sphere accounts of news media and media as a fourth estate, that governments need to be held to account. We need to have a public debate very often about the policy responses to crises. And at a more critical level, we also need to engage with questions of political culpability, responsibility, and the scandals that are generated through the inadequate ways in which sometimes states and governments respond to this huge public event. And we can see many governments around the world falling well short of a beneficent and kind of public spirited response to COVID-19. Misinformation and corruption, propaganda, and the othering of minorities has all been sadly amply demonstrated, I think, in the ways in which many governments have responded. And indeed, perhaps no governments can be seen to have, you know, perfectly enacted and responded to this crisis. And that will be something that will need to be looked at in retrospect. Although here in the UK, that debate now is well underway with Dominic Cummings, who was the chief advisor to Boris Johnson, now dishing the dirt, if you like, from a very interesting and fascinating vantage point of being an insider in terms of those key decision-making processes. Crises can very often tip over into political crises, and the pandemic is no different from that. And there's some very interesting work, I think, both in terms of Naomi Klein's understanding of crisis and how that becomes a moment of trauma in which political and economic elites can very often take advantage of that moment to consolidate their own particular agendas. But so too, from a more cultural perspective, there's interesting academic work as well, I think, in terms of the ways in which a crisis that turns into a political crisis can also unleash the power, if you like, the pent-up power within civil society, that sometimes elites are placed on the back foot and they have to work very hard to try and maintain their legitimacy. And these crises feed into deeper political structures and processes of mobilization for change. A further agenda, which is one perhaps that's particularly pertinent to Turkey, and I'll mention this in a moment, and it will be of no surprise to anybody in the conference, I imagine, who will know much, much more about this than I do. But some of the major organizations in the world that are interested in and concerned about journalist security and insecurity, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Sans Frontières, the International News Safety Institute, are all documenting the ways in which COVID-19 has been used and abused by some political authorities, particularly political states of an authoritarian bent, but also states who are not strongly disposed to authoritarianism, but are nevertheless using the cover of COVID-19 to try and curb the usual interrogative nature of journalism, and are using COVID-19 as a way of intimidating, harassing journalists around the world. So this particular crisis is also a crisis of journalism and press freedom around the world. And the concern is that many of these initiatives that have been introduced by various governments will continue thereafter once the pandemic is more or less brought under global control. Many of us working in the field have previously noted the crisis of journalism within itself, the economic restructuring of journalism, the industrial restructuring, the part played by digitalization, the increased competitiveness within the news world, and how all of that has impacted upon journalism and its capacity to step up to the table, if you like, and engage meaningfully with a pandemic of the nature of COVID-19. The changing nature of the digital media ecology is certainly part and parcel of the interest arena, if you like, of media and communication scholars. And there's a lot of interest in the way in which memes and stories are morphing like viruses around the world, and the ways in which different forms of journalistic translation, or the ways in which storytelling is enacted in and through the different genres and subgenres of journalism. Much of this research, I would argue, is understandably, in part, but nevertheless insufficiently, rooted in a particular national framework, if you like. What Ulrich Beck, excuse me, the social theorist, who has a lot to say about COVID-19, I think, although he's sadly, he died a few years ago, but his ideas of global risk society, I think, are very pertinent to what we're talking about. And he also talked about methodological nationalism, the way in which academics very often are, for various reasons, looking at a particular crisis through a set of glasses, if you will, that are nationalistically framed. That we, are interested in our own national media, our own national populations, our own government policy responses, and so on. And all of that is, as I say, understandable. But this is also a global pandemic. We need to understand its origins, and we need to understand the nature of globalization and the way in which globalization now speaks to a world of interconnectedness and interdependency. And the pandemic is no exception to that, of course, in terms of the mobility of people getting onto planes. You can't ring fence this disease as much as people might want to or say they can. And of course, the solutions, if there are solutions, will have to be found at an international and transnational level, as well as local and national. So that's what's seems to me to be on the research agenda. And as I said, I'm not trying to minimize at all the importance of the national. as the domain for academic research. And I was just looking at the Committee to Protect Journalists, who have, along with other professional international organizations concerned about journalist security, has picked up on the extent to which China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, it says now, are the world's worst jailers of journalists. We hear a lot of reports coming out of Turkey of journalists who are reporting under a cloud of fear and intimidation. Now that's something that people in this conference will know a lot more about than I. It's extremely worrying and concerning, of course, and how that impacts upon public knowledge and understanding and policy responses to this disease is something for sustained academic interrogation and research. However, we also, if that's bad enough, of course, there are other dimensions of extreme concern in the world today, and I tend to see this global pandemic as a wake-up call. And if we wanted an image, I like images, the news media like images. If we can find the right image sometimes to encapsulate and symbolize our thinking, sometimes that's of use, not only in the communication of a major pandemic, but also in terms of our particular orientation as academics in terms of the research questions that need to be asked. And here we have a painting by a Russian painter, a contemporary painter, who's working in the poetic realist style. She's entitled her marvelous painting, I think, At the Edge of the World. And what do we see? We see kings and queens and navigators and explorers and maybe entrepreneurs, but also possibly the news media. There's a person there with a camera. And what are they doing? They're looking over the edge of the cliff into the precipice, into the abyss, if you like. And I cannot but help think that this image is an amazing image, which helps to symbolize my feeling about what the media are doing for the most part, which we're looking over the cliff with a degree of dislocation and distancing, slightly in awe possibly of some of the impending perils that are now confronting us at a global scale. But as I say, looking in awe rather than with a mobilization or a concern to try and step up to the task in hand, which is to really, I think, understand the nature and the interconnected nature of many of these crises that are now accelerating, compounding each other, and that are imperiling, I think, the world in a way which is unprecedented. Well, just to quickly remind us of some of these global perils that are now upon us and that now need to be responded to vigorously. Of course, climate change and the ever increasing rise in global temperature, with the target of 1.5, which is seen to be a critical turning point in the way in which human society can continue or not, looking as if that's going to be broken, that those targets of Paris and subsequent initiatives appear to be no longer attainable, which is extremely, extremely worrying, of course. There are, I won't unpack all the complexities that some of you will know about, I'm sure, now, but there's a global race, is there not, to try and bring world temperatures caused by anthropogenic release of carbon dioxide and other gases into the world. But the scientific evidence is clear, as is the increased extinction. The threat of biodiversity loss is now with us. According to a recent analysis, the sixth mass extinction of wildlife on Earth is accelerating. More than 500 species of land animals are on the brink of extinction. From 1970 to the present, 68%, nearly 70% of all population sizes of most mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles have seen a drop of 68%. That's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And, you know, how worrying is that? That is the global picture of loss in animal and other species since 1970, 68%. Agriculture is responsible for 80% of global deforestation. Drivers linked to food production cause 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss. As drivers linked to food production are causing 50% of freshwater biodiversity loss. 52% of agricultural production land is now being degraded. These and other indices of human impact on global society and food production and ecologies are now unsustainable. They are simply unsustainable and have to be addressed. I lived in Australia for a long time. I have a deep affection for Australia. Of course, in 2019, we are witnessing increased and intensifying extreme weather events all around the world. And in Australia, we saw in 2019, less so this year, but quite likely to be repeated in years ahead, mega fires. We see them elsewhere in the world as well, of course. But scenes of absolute apocalyptic devastation. You know, the sunlight is being blocked out in the days, fire fronts of hundreds of miles long, cities vulnerable to devastation and destruction. Over 1 billion animals in Australia, including exotic species and species that were struggling anyway, now probably put into a bracket of structural extinction. These events are increasingly in the news, as are, you know, the melting glaciers and melting ice flows, increased famines caused by land which is no longer sustainable, and so on. So the types of planetary threats that are now converging upon us include, clearly, climate change, biodiversity loss, mass extinction, food, water, and energy insecurity, financial meltdowns, prompting migrations, both in terms of internally displaced peoples within nation states, but also across borders, increasing conflict, increasing wars, weapons of mass destruction. All of these are compounding in various humanitarian disasters and global pandemics. Kate Raworth, I think, offers us an excellent view of you know, where sustainable life is located. I wouldn't unpack this model, but it's a very useful model, I think, of thinking about the ways in which, you know, what does it take for a human society to live and sustainably and to prosper, both in terms of social equity and political participation, as well as the basic necessities of life, and what happens when we overshoot our relationship with nature and what it can offer us in a sustainable way. As I said earlier, I think many of the global crises that we are now encountering cannot be seen in isolation. We too often talk about them as if they are separate. There is good evidence to suggest, I think, that zoonotic diseases, including COVID-19, are expressive in many ways of the relationship between human beings and nature, and that these crises are mutually compounding. So just a couple of examples here. Farm workers are essential to our lives and the economy. They produce the food on our tables, but their health is at risk due to warming temperatures, the current COVID-19 pandemic, and a lack of healthcare coverage. So, you know, crises don't exist in isolation. They are always politically, socially, culturally, and economically contextualized. And there are other crises which are feeding into the types of crises that gain news attention and focus. The Pacific is another little report. The Pacific is dealing with a dengue fever outbreak amid COVID-19 and tropical cyclone Harold. We have to shift our thinking, I think, from thinking about crises as kind of analytically separable or ontologically discrete. They are part and parcel of a global interdependency and interconnectedness, both in a negative as well as in a positive way. Now, there are many ways of theorizing global crises and global collapse, and I won't unpack those now, I don't have time. But here's my attempt to try and encapsulate what I defined as a global crisis, and I've been writing about this for some years, and I've noticed that people now, thankfully, are increasingly talking about global crises, although 10 years ago, the very term itself was hardly ever used. This is my definition. I say that global crises are crises whose origins and outcomes cannot, for the most part, be confined inside the borders of nation states. Rather, they are endemic to and meshed within and potentially encompassing of today's late modern capitalistic world, a deterritorializing world that has become increasingly interconnected, interdependent, and in flux, that is to say, globalized. Their impacts and tumultuous effects register through and beyond the porous borders of nation states, and for the most part require cooperative responses from civil societies and systems of governance that are no less transnational in scope. Well, what about media and communications? How global crises are defined, dramatized, and deliberated on the media stage, how they are signaled, symbolized, and sensationalized, and how they are denied and dissimulated or simply ignored and rendered invisible proves critical. The stakes couldn't be higher given the catastrophic consequences of combined global crises now impacting on the world's ecology and all life forms on planet Earth, including human society. Media and communications are intimately involved in the conflicts and divisions produced or exacerbated by global crises, as well as the enactments and demands for peace, including those for social and environmental justice. I'm happy to unpack any of those aspects or dimensions of thinking about the role of media in communications. And it's not all a bad news story by any means, although there is a lot of bad news within that story. So what about COVID-19 then? As many of you will already know and be thinking, I'm sure, COVID-19 is not simply a deadly aberration temporarily wreaking havoc on the world. I think this is to mistake symptom for cause. COVID-19, rather, is both expressive of and exacerbating today's multiple, accelerating, and mutually compounding global crises. Zoonotic diseases, Ebola, avian flu, MERS are on the increase. And it's generally, I think, by people who have looked at this, epidemiologists and scientists and others and major institutions, that these zoonotic diseases are seen to be on the increase because of our relationship to nature, and that the production of monocultural agriculture, which breaks down the capacity of nature to ward off various diseases, the destruction of forestry for the growth of new crops, particularly for animal feed, and so on, the continuing engagement in wildlife trade, the increased urbanization of the world, which is encroaching on with ever increased proximity onto areas of wildlife and so on. All of this is conducive to creating circumstances in which diseases can morph and be transferred into human populations with devastating effect. Pandemics of this nature have been predicted for many, many years now, going back over a decade or more, I think. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, and World Wildlife Fund International are all convinced of the view that pandemics like COVID-19 are in part related to the destruction of nature. So that's basically my argument. If this is the reality, then there is an expectation and a responsibility that journalism and news media, as well as academics who are researching news media and communications, take this as a critical benchmark and start to interrogate what is happening in the news media precisely in relation to these types of concerns. Now, that's not to say that that agenda that I outlined earlier isn't important or necessary, but I'm also saying that this wider, deeper, bigger agenda of relating global crises to the nature of global world society and how it is inexorably and incessantly and now producing a conflux of different crises that are merging and morphing with devastating impacts upon human society it really has to be at the forefront of all our thinking and the thinking of news media. And so far, I see very little evidence in the news media, and I do not see sufficient research interest or effort going into exploring and encouraging, if you like, what can be done better in the news media. I'm aware that my time is running out, so I'll...
Yes.
Yes, okay. So there is a lot missing in terms of that news media agenda and also the academic agenda. What's needed? We need journalism to rise to the scale of the impending unfolding disaster. We need to see journalism treating this as a war situation, with daily dispatches from the front lines of the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, ecological degradation. Power holders need to be held to account, along with the rest of us. When will we see the necessary holistic consciousness or this ecological awareness of a world in crisis begin to inform and shape the moral horizons and norms of journalism storytelling? And how can journalism's communicative architecture, including the enhanced connectivity of social media, be creatively harnessed and deployed to raise the alarm and publicly debate the necessary responses, both cognitively recognizing and culturally affirming the nature, scale, and complexity of the tasks ahead and the profound transformations needed? And to end, I return to this wonderful painting, albeit a painting of foreboding and doom, as I see it, The World's End by Anna Berezovskaya's depiction, I think, which encapsulates my thinking about the way in which we are increasingly noting these global crises, but have yet to join up the dots, yet to see the interconnections, both that need to be portrayed and represented and debated within news media, but also within our own academic discourse on our own research agenda when we are exploring a crisis like the global pandemic that we are now witnessing. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Professor Cottle. If you could unshare your slides so that you could see the faces. Thank you. Well, that's been I'm already tired a bit, but that's been a really rich content presentation. not only describing the current agenda with respect to the pandemic, but also perhaps redescribing the pandemic as the symptom rather than cause of all this stir, all this discussions and happenings in the world today. I really do enjoyed this description, which have been in circulation perhaps a year ago with the contribution of few environmentalists and other similar political activists, but then it's really been buried under this very destructive materialism of perception involving numbers, deaths, the vaccines, and nationalism, vaccine nationalism, and so on and so forth, which kind of, I guess, took us away from that perspective, describing COVID-19 as the symptom of larger sustainability problems. So thank you very much again. I really do enjoy took notes and whatnot. So as it has become customary, I turn to the chat box and try to see the questions coming. There are comments, not questions. I guess Ümit Hoca had a question. I'm trying. Yeah, there it is. Okay, this is. I think this has to do with the risks of reporting and its supposed countermeasure, which is banning people off the networks, like Donald Trump's being banned from Facebook, Twitter, etc. Would Professor Cuttle see this as a censorship or a measure, a positive measure? This is a question, yeah.
I think my view on that is that, issues of press freedom within liberal democracy means that we all have a responsibility to others, that we don't engage in hate speech, for example. So wherever that originates from, yes, I don't think that should be granted a platform. It's a basic kind of premise of, I think, a democratic society, that we don't demonize and denigrate others or minorities and place them thereby at increased risk. And that goes for whoever, I think, is uttering those forms of words. And words are actions. And we know in Britain, and we know in America, following some of the, I was going to say inarticulate, but actually politically consequential outbursts of President Trump, that acts of violence and harassment and intimidation of others has taken place. So in that sense, yes, I would strongly support Trump not having free access to any form of media where he feels it acceptable to engage in that type of speech, which is fascistic in nature. I also think it's no coincidence that when Donald Trump first came to power and took, was inaugurated as president, that one of his first targets in his sights was precisely journalists. It was journalists that he set up as a kind of scapegoat minority, which is a kind of a ploy of any authoritarian, I think, to try and create a sense of social attack by some minority or some group, and thereby to use that group as a vehicle for kind of whipping up collective prejudice and hate. It's a very effective way, I think, of sowing seeds of confusion, and also, of course, knowingly in his case, and he's conceded this in interviews, that he did it deliberately as a way of warding off in advance, if you like, the known criticism and critique that would be leveled at him by American journalists in mainstream media. So, how clever was he to try and take on the media, if you like, to emasculate them in advance, so that he would then have a clear field of advancing his particular form of rabid political discourse in the months and years ahead. So a long-winded response by me, but sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but I use my moderator authority to extend it a few more minutes, Nazife Hocam and Pınar Hocam. I guess I will be tolerated for doing so. But one of the very interesting observations in Professor Cutle's speech was about globalization, I think. We have been reading and writing globalization for quite some time and reducing it to, I don't know, movement of people, money, culture, and goods, services, etc. But this time, pandemic has proven to be the truly the embodiment of globalization. It cannot be ignored. You cannot be pro or con of that reality, I guess. Yeah. So in this context, there is this question about the global media, and Begüm Burak is asking to all, I guess, keynote speakers, is the global media in this context a hindrance or promotion for democratic values, since lots of fake news circulated on social media? And she also cites one case where somebody was offered money to promote fake news about a certain vaccine brand. So this is sort of a question. So.
Okay, so my response to that is that it's both, of course, isn't it? That global media are, as indeed with national media, I think, around the world, they have the capacity and the potential to be both the vehicles for democratic enactment and advance, but they can also become the vehicles to maintain hierarchies of power and inequality. And it seems to me that it's our job as media and communication, or journalists, scholars and academics, to carefully interrogate what is happening in the news media. I would say, and it's something that I've been arguing for some time, that there is a kind of a default position, I think, within many academic schools of media and communications and so on, is that we are there. It seemed to be the case to criticize and critique news media and to tease out the dominant discourse or the deficiencies or their inadequate forms of deliberation. And useful and essential as that is, we also need to tease out what is productive, it seems to me, about within the contemporary and existing world of journalism, as a way of better fine-tuning our understanding of the value of journalism to democratic processes and how civil societies can be vitalized and performed, if you like, in and through news media, as a way of deepening and extending that type of discourse. So, and I can give you, we don't have time, but I could give you many examples of where mainstream media are in fact doing a good job, I think. They're doing an amazing job. I've even seen some really good journalism that has engaged precisely with the issues that I've tried to raise in my little talk. But it's a minority. It's not systematic. It's not there every day. It's patchy. Some news media exhibit those traits more than others. And there are counter trends, as some people have indicated, in social media and so on. So it's a moving story, I think, this, isn't it? And we can't just put a label on the news media, including social media, as good or bad. That might have been the case a few years ago, with mainstream media being labeled as universally bad, and social media being seen as the panacea or the hope for, the invigoration of democracy. both of those positions are empirically, I think, untenable. It's a more complicated interaction, and there is some hope in the machine, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question from Professor Irvan comes, it's about skeptical approaches to vaccination. He asks, there are an increasing number of people who have become skeptical about vaccination. Do you think this is a result of negative media coverage? What's the role of media in that?
Okay, I'm not an expert on that. My take on that, and from what I've heard from other people who are more closely looking at those issues, is that very often, for example, minority groups in Britain, where there's been a low uptake of vaccines, that in part is to do with mistrust and a degree of dislocation, if you like, from society, born of their own experience of living in Britain, and some of the ways in which governments have treated minorities. So it's not simply, I don't think, a kind of an ideological or a representational problem of what's in the media. It's also about people's lived experiences, their lived culture, and their lived, if you like, horizons of expectation and hope, or the lack of hope, and a more skeptical horizon that's been formed by their practice and their experience. Having said that, we do live in a world, don't we, where increasingly it's possible for some people to live in a social bubble of social media of their choice. They're not exposed to a wider field of perspectives or the deliberation of their preferred viewpoint, and that can consolidate, I think, in damaging ways, and ways that can be deadly ultimately to their health if they're not fully briefed of a more informed and more reasoned viewpoint.
Okay, so that ends the questions on the chat box, and I'd like to open a space for the panelists, the key speakers, actually, if they have anything, because they have access to sound, so they don't need to write their questions. Yeah. And we might end in 10 minutes, if the organizers allow me, by circulating questions, comments on all of the contributions to this panel. Any questions? Anything that you would like to add, Professor Atabek, Professor Simmons, and also Professor Irvan, Professor Güngör?
I don't have a question, but I have a request, if possible, from Professor Kotel.
Sure.
Can we have this last picture of this Russian painter to be shared? Because it explains everything. And are we included, the professors, are we included in that picture?
There's this, if there's this one guy in the, I liked it very much too, in the painting, who looks directly at the viewer, only one, and who drops the apple to the abyss right after the clock, right? So that person I kind of associated with the academia. I don't know.
Yes, I would certainly see myself as looking into the abyss, I think, and I think many professors do, but it's a question of what we do after we look, I suppose, isn't it, really? But thank you for that. I mean, I would like to ask a couple of questions as well, if I may. As I said at the outset, all of you, I'm sure, will know a lot more about the situation of journalism in Turkey than I do. So I'm interested to hear your views on, how journalism has performed and the types of difficulties and constraints that journalists have encountered in this particular moment of covering the pandemic. And then secondly, I wanted to ask the extent, what's your perception of the way in which journalism is or is not grappling with the issues of, climate change and biodiversity loss, and this crush of world crises that I see as interconnected. You know, how is Turkish journalism faring, and how is it managing, if it is, to step up to the severity of these crises today?
Anybody?
I think it's Süleyman İrman who would answer to this one.
And after Süleyman, I will do.
Okay, Ümit Hoca said that journalism is dying, so I shouldn't say. But let me tell you this.
For the moment, we are alive.
To my view, actually, Turkish media sees climate change as an international problem, not a national problem. Unfortunately, they don't even cover climate change. And many stories actually coming from international media. It's like a translation of stories as if something happening in the world, but not in Turkey. So Turkish media is mostly reactive towards any crisis. I mean, they don't. I write about preventive journalism. They should practice preventive journalism. They should concentrate on the crisis before they arise. But Turkish media mostly are reactive. They just look at the authorities. They just, I mean, in most cases. So I think the problem that I asked to you is a Turkish problem. There are many skepticals now against vaccinations. So I thought that is the result of negative news stories about the pandemic. So I'm not sure whether this is a universal or international problem, but I think that the British media are much better than the Turkish one in covering the crisis and making good stories. That's I think my point. Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in the first part of the question of Professor Katıl, which deals with the risks of reporting in Turkey, and he I think cited it as one of the agendas, research agendas. I'm not sure if it's an actual research agenda in Turkey, but the situation of reporting in Turkey is really, I don't know how to put it, under grim conditions, and it shows a very interesting bifurcation. The mainstream conventional media is usually seen as a dead avenue. In other words, it really doesn't offer a national coverage of anything, let alone COVID-19, except for repeating the arguments by the authorities, the Ministry of Health and the government, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, on the part of social media, especially YouTube, there's it's the mainstream media now in Turkey, frankly. There is no doubt about it. The mainstream media has become Twitter, YouTube. I'm not very much in Facebook, but these two I routinely follow, and I got personal news from these outlets anyway. So that is, there is a free atmosphere there, frankly, but I'm not sure how national it is at all. So it is free because it is not national. It is most of the news are coming from abroad, and obviously, as you have been, Professor Katıl, mentioning, we have passed that age when we thought that social media is more democratic or blah blah blah. So my advice to any young people, my students or whatever, is to be cautious. As cautious as you are towards the conventional media. So that is the situation. It's not easy. It's not easy at all for journalists, reporters in Turkey. I mean, you can be, as this has become a commonplace. I mean, just tweet something and you're detained. That is the situation.
Yeah.
Anything else, folks?
Yeah, by the way, I say thank you for his speech, very satisfying speech to Professor Simon, and welcome. And thank you for joining us. And thank you for all of us to join us. So, to Greg, to Ümit Atabek, and to Halil Nalçoğlu for a very nice, very satisfying moderating us. Thank you.
So, Nazife, thank you. You're practically saying cut it short. we got the message. My dear Dean, I
told him very little time, and
I know. I was going to do the same. I was going to do what you have done. Well, I totally agree with Professor Güngör that it's been really nice. One of the nicest, actually, bunch of speeches and discussions in recent times. Thank you very much for organizing everything, Nazife Hocam. And we also thank to Üsküdar University and its board, Professor Tarhan, for supporting this event for 8 years in a row. Hopefully many more 8 years in coming. And that ends our panel, I guess.
And we don't forget her invitation to Antalya next year.
Yeah. That's the underlying message, subliminal message anyway, that we would like to meet in some southern or Aegean, I don't know, nice towns of Turkey where we could enjoy without the threat by COVID-19, hopefully joining us, holding each other, shaking hands, and so on and so on, which I really missed. I mean, I don't like shaking hands, but I even missed shaking hands. So thank you very much. See you in another event, and goodbye.
Thank you,
nice
Professor
day.
Simon Cottle, Gregory Simons, Ümit Atabek, Halil Nalçoğlu.
Thank you.
Thank you all of us.
Goodbye.
Hope to see you face to face in conference next year.
Yes. Yeah. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.